way to kind of show basically how to show Wilden's work and its major contribution. And I think still it's very much its relevance for today, 50 years after it was initially written. Just in terms of Stiegler, I want to point out this notion of systemic stupidity, because I see it in everyday life. I'm sure a lot of you see it too. That we see it all the time on the internet. We see it in the media. We see it in everyday conversation, etc. And this is interesting because he's really juxtaposing to this systemic stupidity, an associated milieu of intellectuals who would be in an economy of contribution. And I think this is something we should go back to. I like this notion that Arto's a friend in Russia that he translated, the contra elites, as another moment, of kind of confronting what we're going through, which seems to be worsening day by day. But this notion of systemic stupidity should be taken very, very, seriously and acutely all the time. And he says it is founded, and we can talk about this later and go back to it. I refer to page 50, and maybe the best way to approach this is look at the digital communication of Wilden and then go back to Stiegler for greater clarification on what is meant by digital reticulation of a positive externality that comes through this new form of dramatization. So I want to keep page 50 open, as we go forward, because I think it's a very interesting contribution to where we are in the quote internet highway, in this age of, I guess we could call it maybe the third stage of the cybernetic revolution. The first one being post-World War II, and the second, the internet, and now all the social media that goes with the internet communication. So we can talk about that. Again, this is an experiment in trying to invent some new concepts and new critical tools. So I will go back there. I think it's best that we do go on and start talking about cybernetics more. I want to recommend, I don't really recommend it as an easy read, but it is the major work that Wiener wrote. It's called Cybernetics, and the subtitle, On Control and Communication in the Animal and the Machine. And this is Wiener's statement about cybernetics. That was published at the time of the first wave of the cybernetic revolution. And the general edition came out in 1948, another crucial date, the Wallace presidency, which is first and foremost on my mind, the Truman Doctrine, the beginning of the State of Israel, et cetera, et cetera. So 48 was a crucial date in many things, and probably the next phase of the building of the military-industrial complex. Again, I date the warfare state from 38. This goes back to many active discussions with Stanley Aronowitz and a few other people that the warfare state was really created consciously by the Roosevelt administration as a way out of the Depression. That the many of the moments there were not possible without creating a warfare state. So again, I think it's very important to remember this, as we go forward. And 48 would be the first upsurge in that post-World War II. And then, of course, the phrase military-industrial complex is first articulated by Dwight Eisenhower and then taken up by C. Wright Mills in the classic work, The Power Elite. All of which are all dated today, but I think fundamentally still very sound. So the interesting thing here about Wiener, it's a very technical text. It's a very difficult read, but if you're up to it, you could look at, Gestalt and universals. That's 11 pages on shape and forms of consciousness and how universals are formed in the machine world, and then cybernetics and psychopathology, which I think is very important for Bernard Stiegler, especially, on symbolic misery that we talked about last time. So again, this is a classic text in the field. We didn't assign it because it's even denser than the Wilden. It's written in a very MIT scientific type of language with the German mind behind it, even though he was born in the States. His family was German, first generation German immigrants. And so Wiener, very interesting. To his credit, he would not participate in military buildup, lend his expertise on cybernetics for that. He refused in the late 40s. He was against the development of the hydrogen bomb. So he did have some human qualities, that most cyberneticians did not have in terms of how they saw this cybernetic revolution. And he also, I think I mentioned to you, threatened to resign from MIT, leave, because of his good friend Dirk Struett was up for dismissal because he was a Marxist. And Struett is a classic example of longevity in the Marxist tradition. He outdoes all the fascists. He lived to be 106. He was a walker, and he taught until he was 103. So Dirk Struett is quite a great character. His really accessible book is A Short History of Mathematics. So he knew most of this stuff very, very well. So anyway, just a little bit of that background, and maybe I can make a few remarks about Wilden, and I'll let Arto's done some outlining for us too today. But I'd like to, again, reintroduce Tony Wilden to you. Tony Wilden was a graduate student at Johns Hopkins working on Montaigne. He was in comparative literature in the 60s. And he was working on a dissertation on Montaigne, and he discovered the work of then what was called French Freud, Jacques Lacan. And he was really impressed with the reading of Freud that Lacan had done. So he became, immersed in writing his dissertation, a Lacanian approach to the work of the great Michel de Montaigne. And he became the translator of three seminal works of Lacan, including Function and Field of Language in Psychoanalysis and The Subversion of the Subject and the Dialectic of Desire. So these were very, very seminal pieces of Lacan that are found in Écrit, and he comes very much out of this background during this period, coming from the Lacanian moment. And he was the first, again, to translate Lacan into English. And at the structuralist moment, the controversy, the famous event at Johns Hopkins in 1966, Wilden called himself the unhappy consciousness translator of Jacques Lacan, right? So this is where he began. And then he took a tremendous interest in scientific discourse as propaganda. And I think if you read another essay in here, this would be one that would be very interesting to look at in terms of just for ideas. We know this already. We can say what else is new, but in a sense, it's very interesting the way he goes about it in the introduction, the scientific discourse as propaganda. This is the first chapter, knowledge as a commodity. And this is then repeated by Jean-François Lyotard in 1979 in The Postmodern Condition, in which he frames knowledge as only exchange value, no longer really has use value. This is Lyotard going forward. So remember that Wilden is really looking at science in terms of exchange value and also as explosions of semantic fields and syntactical moments in analog and digital communication that ultimately frames the scientific discourse as a propaganda tool, right? And he goes through this. And he's very interested in that time, what we now speak about as climate change, ecosystems, and the ecology movements. So again, this is 1972. The influence of Lacan is enormous. He has Patrick. If you're interested, there's a section on the real, the symbolic, and the real, the imaginary, and the symbolic. a whole section on that, a critique of phallocentrism as well, symbolic and imaginary exchange. It's a very, very dense book worth rereading and reading more and more. And then the last chapter I like particularly, and maybe we'll have time to do it, the literature of opposition and identity, how oppositional culture is found, and he has a very, very interesting thing on solipsism and the mirror stage and the transcendence of the ego and Sartre. So again, we're just looking at one section for our purposes on homo datum and emerging contours of new subjectivity vis-a-vis analog and digital communication. But this book is really, in my estimation, worthy of study. And I think I mentioned to you again, Jameson's Marxism in Form and the Prison House of Language came out during this period, on the prison house of language being the structuralist approach to language as a tyrannical feedback system, a recursive system that is always operative. And then, of course, Aronowitz's False Promises, the shaping of the working class in the US was out at this time, where collective begging or collective bargaining is critiqued fully, and et cetera. They were all at UC San Diego. Thank you, Patrick. Yeah, all three. They all knew each other. And Susan Buck Morse happened to be there too for a little while. And the famous story about her book on negative dialectics of Adorno, that Marcuse said too many footnotes, right? Not enough text, right? So anyway, so yeah, this was a great place, a great moment in the history of thinking, in my opinion, the systems of thinking, a real high point that translated into interesting programs. Phil will know this, Santa Cruz, the History of Consciousness program. Of course, Irvine, became a center for this, and San Diego, Marcuse was there, stayed until his death, right? And there's many interviews with Frederick Olofsson during that period. A great place to be for intellectual ideas in the 70s all the way to the late 70s. So anyway, again, to introduce him is very difficult because this is an extremely difficult, again, a chapter that demands an incredible amount of knowledge to get through. But we chose it, I guess, because of the difference that he makes. He's going to try to draw a distinction early on. And I don't know if you had a time to read it and how you took to it. Maybe I could ask about that. But the first thing he's really going to do is draw the two modes of information technology, the analog and the digital, right? He's going to do that. And then he's going to speak about the first example of the analog as the analog computer, right? And then putting both together, he uses examples, of course, of the analog, the map, the clock, the ruler, the thermometer, volume control, et cetera, et cetera. He gives very good examples of how analog communication operates and how the analog computer itself works. But he does say what both of them of the both types, the real situation and the mathematical formulas on which it does, and what's being measured is a continuous functioning computer. This is what happens in the analog communication, right? Whereas the digital, on the other hand, presupposes the abacus. And those of you interested in Capitalism and Arithmetic, a great book by Frank Zweck. And again, I don't really apologize for the references. I just think it enhances some for people that have endless time to read and reread. But anyway, Capitalism Arithmetic, of the transformation of the abacus into the Treviso arithmetic and the multiplication tables, Zweck makes a claim that this is the birth of capitalism, that you needed that mathematical model outside of the counting system of the abacus to that. And then, of course, Wilden goes into the adding machine invented by Pascal. People forget, Pascal not only had the wager, and it's interesting he uses the word wager, he invented the adding machine, the modern adding machine. Descartes, famous for the analytical geometry. So the 17th century could be the beginning of all this. And Wiener is also situated there with Leibniz. And I know the Institute and a lot of philosophy programs don't focus that much anymore on the 17th century. But the more I read, the more I'm beginning to see that this is really one of the great periods in the history of philosophy for what we're dealing with today, with Arto's, project on Homo Datum, what we're trying to expound upon here. You have Leibniz in the invention of the calculus, Pascal in the adding machine, Descartes juxtaposing certainty and probability, all kinds of experiments in probability theory that are coming up, many, many things that play out today. Before there's the shift in mathematics to, the Riemann lines and the, of course, Gödel's paradoxes and all of that. But this is very interesting as a background, and unfortunately, the educational system doesn't do anything with us. So on this level, to go back, to Wiener for a second, he looks at Newtonian and Bergsonian time in the beginning, right? So again, I'm very interested in the temporal aspects here, vis-a-vis the Heideggerian approach to it, if you will, and of course a Marxist, theory of time to historical time, if you will. These kind of two notions of the time. So then, so he's then going to go to the digital, and I found the thing most relevant for us, and I know we're going to take at least 2 weeks on this, is the section on language, right, and play. So if I could jump around just for a second, and then we can have a discussion, and I'll turn it over to Arto too. That there is a whole system of language that Wilden is looking at. This is on page 163. The analog is pregnant with meaning, he says. So the analog computer, the analog devices, thinking analogically has meaning, whereas the digital is relatively speaking barren with meaning, has only signification. So he's developing here what he'll go into later into a semiotic, sense of what they both do together as a semiotic function in a way. So this is crucial. 162, 163, from 163, the interest of the distinction between analog and digital is even more striking if we consider the relationship between semantics on the one hand and syntax in the two forms of communication. The analog is pregnant with meaning, whereas the digital domain of signification is relatively somewhat barren, right? It is also impossible to translate the rich semantics of the analog into digital form for communication or another organism. But this is true of the most trivial sensations like biting your tongue and the most enviable situations, I don't know if it's enviable, being in love. It is impossible, to precisely describe such events except by recourse to unnameable common experiences, that is a continuum, right? But this impression carries with it a fundamental and probably essential ambiguity. A clenched fist may communicate, for example, and I like he uses this notion, excitement, fear, anger, impending assault, frustration, good morning, or revolutionary power or zeal, right? So the digital, on the other hand, because it's concerned with boundaries and because it depends upon arbitrary combination, has all the syntax to be precise and may be entirely unambiguous. And this is interesting too, how the digital communication and this digital reticulation that Stiegler will speak about is really eliminates a lot of the ambiguity in everyday life and language. These gray zones, if you will, to use a contemporary program. But anyway, the gray areas, the layered thinking is really being overwritten, if you will, by digital non-ambiguous communication, in many ways. So the level of the ideology of opposition and structure is really very limited. It becomes very reductionistic, at least according to Wilden in the digital. And the analog gains in semantics, it loses in syntax. And what digital gains in syntax, it loses in semantics. So it's to say the analog does not possess the syntax necessary to say no or to say anything involving not. One can, refuse or reject in the analog, but one cannot deny or negate, right? So this is interesting, how this happens in the digital versus the analog. So these kind of distinctions. Then later on, and this is another aspect that I think is worthy of discussion, this notion of play. By the way, Gregory Bateson, who he draws heavily on, the author of the book Steps to an Ecology of Mind, a magnificent text, especially the section on the double bind and schizophrenia, which Deleuze and Guattari play a lot on. And, if we had time, we would take up their proposition that Marx's Jewish question is the opening double bind of modernity. That's the text which you study for the double bind in all of its moments. And maybe, again, something we can do later on. But in play, he goes back to the communicational play of animals' life. Animal play provides with a methodological insight into the genesis of digital language and a large yardstick to distinguish animal communication from human language. So it's useful to suppose a methodological discontinuity in the continuous process which produced language and to use the amorphous domain of play to mediate the distinction. So he's going to be using play this way, and he'll go back to the psychoanalytic study of the Fort Dog game, the kid with the spool throwing it out, returning away there, Fort Dog. Comes back to someone, and this is where according to Lacan, that the phonemes and the right, the language is really appropriated by the child in terms of abandonment and security. This is what's going on in this Fort Dog game. So he's going to use this as well. I don't want to go so far in because there are tables of relations at the end in the appendixes of Wilden, mainly the analog and the digital aspects about how this works with language. And I think this is very open and revealing, very, very interesting. If you look at 194, for example, how the analog command or request, whereas the digital is reportage, right? Semantics, pragmatics, syntactics, digital. Present, past, present, and future in the digital. The shifters, verbal shifters, which, Roman Jakobson is so good on, and Trubotsky are very good on in linguistic theories, into nouns, right? The typography, information, cadence, loudness, frequency, alphabet, and phonemes in the digital. Poetry, digital is prose, right? Evocation of images, information about concepts. So he gives you these tables of relationships vis-a-vis the analog and the digital, which we could also look at. But anyway, I'd like to hear from you if you had a chance to read this or some interest in this. Is it too much in terms of its technicalities? And because it does presuppose a lot of, I guess, some background in communication theory, right, etc., and the cybernetic models that he's trying to employ here. Yeah. So I'll throw it out to you. And Arto, do you want to add to this? In a sense, I mean, I want to emphasize language play, and these distinctions that are made both temporally and in,
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to add just a little bit, maybe the 2 pages before before you started reading. But yeah, I'm also curious what people think is an initial reaction to the presentation, engagement by Wilden with these 2 words, the analog and the digital.
I have a question.
Yeah.
which is the historicity of these concepts, because the digital arises within a context which is not that of the context where he's looking at the human body, saying the human body has both analog and digital. Well, this is an anachronism, right? A conceptual anachronism. And so, which is fine. It's just that it would be helpful to clarify what is the occasion for making these distinctions that had earlier not been significant, but suddenly become significant. So that's what I'm sort of trying to understand, that it's obviously he's looking at continuities which were earlier not relevant and have become relevant thanks to the digital computer. So he's marking a moment and then taking us back to think about how the seeming novelty of digitality is not so novel, but that is itself a discovery which is working it's responding to a very specific conjuncture, you might say, right?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I my kind of speculative guess is, because I don't know. I mean, Michael can say more, because Michael, I mean, you've encountered people who knew Wilden and etc., and who work with Wilden. But my sense is that, having read the fundamental theoretical orientation of the founders of cybernetics, which I want to read some quotes from later on today, I think for Wilden, having read, some of the foundational motivations behind modern, cybernetic science, I think he's anticipating, in a way, what we're calling socialized cybernetics today. In other words, this type of positivism beginning to function as a political ideology and organizing theory of practical life for contemporary capitalism, or whatever we want to call it. I think he's sensing that before his time, in a way, before socialized cybernetics before cybernetics had fully left the weapons labs and MIT classrooms and become kind of part of America's corporate boardrooms and halls of political power as hegemonic kind of way of making sense of everyday life. I think he's sensing this, but he's realizing that there's no language, there's no philosophical language or sense-making language that speaks of the digital in any way other than the way mathematicians and cyberneticians speak about it, or computer programmers. I think that's why he's writing this book. That's my speculation. I don't know if this is at all.
I'm in agreement. I mean, again, he's also interested in I think, in terms of broadening, this into a kind of scientific psychology of communication theory, and this kind of unity, bringing together both the analog and the digital, et cetera, and doing so through, again, remember, the body is the important part. He's going to talk more about neurology later. And this is, of course, the dream of, if you read neurologists today, if you read people like the philosopher Catherine Malabou, on accidents in ontology, that everybody is seeming to try to take together this brain, this neurological, moment alongside, right? the how do we really communicate, in the brain, in a sense. So I think part of the desire here, if I could put it this way, is the 1895 text of Freud, Project for a New Scientific Psychology, and that Lacan and Wilden then, in his way, with the latest in communication theory. I mean, Lacan never really went into, communication theory with Morin and other people, even though he studied and was friends with Levi-Strauss. But, and Lacan always said we're on the borderline of neurolinguistics. So I think, again, that what's really operating here is a very, very ambitious, to put it mildly, attempt to merge, the findings of modern linguistics, where he goes into genetic structuralism of Piaget, as well as the Lacanian, divisions of orders, in terms of that program, and merge that somewhat with the analog and the digital, and come up with a new form of how we communicate through exchange value at this point, he's really trying to do, the semi-impossible, a Marxist theory of syntax, semantics, and linguistics in general. So I think this is all operative at once.
I mean, just sorry to jump in, Michael, but you just reminded me. I mean, just because I just had this, I think just the way this is, again, I'm operating through a heuristic here. I'm not talking from a position of a well-argued argument, because I'm just trying to figure this out. My sense is that just the way Marxism by 1975 and 78, certainly in the West, but also in the Soviet Union, had already entered a state of deep crisis. By Marxism, I'm referring to, Marxism is just a keyword, I guess, in this sense, for counter-systemic political thought, right? I mean, I don't mean Marxism in the sense of Marx and Lenin and Mao or whatever, but I'm saying as that tradition that engaged in counter-systemic political thought and political struggle for overcoming capitalism as a barbaric way of life, and replacing it with something that was much more the negation of capitalism in all the positive ways that we can imagine. I think as the crisis of Marxist thought in the 1970s, when they got stuck with the critique of political economy, which is always useful and important, but other things were happening in capitalism that maybe were falling behind or falling out of the microscope of Marxism as a body of thought that was supposed to be critical and critically aware of everything that was happening. So I think one of those things was cybernetics, whereby cybernetics, as this kind of new science of that emerged out of World War II, was almost universally accepted both by the capitalist world and also by the Soviet Union. I don't know about the other part, I don't know about China of the 1970s and whether this kind of positivism was also dominating in academic and governing circles. But in the Soviet Union, cybernetics was approached by the most published Soviet scholars pretty much the way it was approached in the United States, but of course with major exceptions. And I think the exception in the United States is Wilden, and the exception in the Soviet Union are people like the philosopher Ilenkov, but also this other interesting philosopher that I'm just going to mention tangentially because his work is not translated into English and it's barely even now being excavated in post-Soviet space. His name was Krylov. He was kind of a well-known scientist, polyglot, and etc. And I'm just in front of me, I have a section of his work, which I think is kind of like a parallel attempt, similar to Wilden's, to make sense of cybernetics, both as a philosophical discipline, in this case of formal mathematics, but not only, and also as an emerging political ideology, perhaps, as starting to intrude in the field of the political. So Krylov's work was also written in the 70s, and one of the chapters is titled as following: Artificial Intelligence and the Reason of the Human Population. Right? So in other words, there's this, I think this must have been in the air when Wilden was writing this for the critical thinkers, the thinkers who were interested in developing counter-systemic, counter-capitalist ways of subverting sort of the moving forces, intellectual and otherwise, of capitalism. I think the same operation is happening. So I think, first of all, when Wilden is kind of writing this chapter, and I do want to read a few sections over the previous 2 pages, maybe together, in that section about the analog and the digital, I think one of the points behind the text that he's suggesting is that the notion of the digital is really should not be equated with the technology that emerged after 1945 in the United States, for example, and other parts of the world. That this distinction, I mean, and I think this is the point that Arvind made. The notions of the digital and the analog are obviously not, they were not invented. The distinction was not invented by Norbert Wiener, by any means. I think the other point that I'm kind of sensing here is that, and I think Michael made a reference to this with Descartes and the importance of the 17th century, the Western European 17th century for the development of capitalism, that maybe we haven't digested very well in the 21st century yet. I almost said the 23rd century, but I think the point here that he's suggesting, Wilden, is that scientific reasoning and and its relationship to what does it mean to be human started long before the invention of cybernetics, but that is forgotten too, you know. And so I think the fundamental difference here is, again, what does it mean to be human, and how does this fundamental political question that we've raised since the beginning of our seminar, how is that question being answered by the founders of cybernetics? And you'll see, I mean, I have like a little bit of a kind of like a background of the initial ideas that went into the formation of cybernetics as a research program that I'm just going to quote some of these founders like Wiener and other people. Their answer to the question, what does it mean to be human, was human beings are flawed creatures of nature, and they really shouldn't be trusted with remaining with playing a central role in politics or in the organization of society, if what we mean by the question, what does it mean to be human, is answered through kind of old school philosophy. In other words, what they call the humanist tradition, if you will, if you want to use that, or the tradition of asking this question, what does it mean to be human, through the conceptual apparatus of philosophy, is useless. It's useless. It did not produce a subjectivity that produced anything but genocide and and world wars and etc. And thus, in order to achieve progress as human beings, we need to shift the lens, and we need to displace human beings as being the center of what does it mean to be human. And by doing that, we also need to displace things like language, and we need to replace it by a new ground. We need to ground how we organize human life, not through some kind of a self-reflective, recursive, as Heidegger might say, through your teacher, Michael Sherman. Instead of answering the question, what does it mean to be human, and thus how we should organize politics and the economy and etc., through this kind of a complex self-questioning, reflecting upon history and our actions and the actions of those that came before us, through systems of ideas about how to live life meaningfully and how to deal with contingencies, through this process of reflection, self-reflection, recursion. You go through something, you stop and you reflect on how it affected you, and then you act accordingly, you adjust. Instead of doing that, cyberneticists propose a totally new way of making sense of living, and they're basically saying we can live better if we live life by looking at ourselves and as if we're indistinguishable from the machines that we created that function along a certain logic in a certain way. And that's a huge step that goes in a way that breaks new ground in ways that are not necessarily all negative and dystopian, but they certainly are if they are executed under capitalist logic, right? Or they seem to be. But the founders of cybernetics did not see that, right? Because they were in service of imperial capitalist politics. But before we get there, I think that's what Wilden is doing. I think Wilden is seeing this kind of neo-imperialist politics in the aftermath of World War II, with the hegemony of the United States. I think he's seeing the new technological base that emerged from the war, and he's seeing how, and I'm just going to say this purely speculatively, he's seeing how the racism-based politics of the British Empire and the Anglo-Saxon global imperial establishment, the United States and Britain, and the remnants, the scientific remnants of its vanquished racist foe, Nazi Germany, and we'll see how the scientific legacy of Nazi Germany actually is very well alive in a certain sense and active in the European Union and elsewhere in business management schools throughout the European Union and etc. And as this kind of the central role played by racism, in other words, by that way of answering the question, what does it mean to be human, that humankind is divided into these different breeds of people, just the way horses are divided into breeds and other creatures, and that seems to be the natural order of things. And thus whether you are interpreting this kind of racist politics through the Nazi lens, where class struggle is fully replaced by race struggle as the true, genuine historical form of politics, or whether you're doing it through the more sneaky British approach, especially much more elegantly hidden American approach. The point is, I feel like cybernetics in its original genealogy in American weapons labs and university labs is basically the recasting of racist politics through different ways. This way, this time leading through the transhumanist solution of the anthropological break, as Klaus Schwab talks about in the last 4 years, the formation of true new types of human breeds that I think they are really hoping for. They'll get there with bioengineering and et cetera. But that's for later on. I do want to. So I think Wilden understands this, and he's worried by this, and he's trying to understand what are the philosophical implications of the digital and the analog distinction that cyberneticians are making, and he's trying to do that in the most meaningful way possible by approaching it philosophically. He's trying to understand, sort of to make sense of the concepts, the categories, and the most importantly, the logic, right? Because logical movement has direct implication about what categories emerge and how the particular categories which lead to concepts, what is their law of motion, right? That's the logical system that underpins your thought, controls that. If you approach a dialectical logic, you're going to arrive at a particular movements of categories, that is different from if you study political economy of capitalism, for example, you're going to arrive at a completely different explanations of the fundamental forces at hand. If you compare somebody who's studying capitalist economics through formal mathematical logic, you're going to get completely different explanatory kind of terrains that are going to emerge, or if you study, a third related but third form of logic, Roy Bhaskar's, very big book called Dialectics, which I attempted to study, and I'm still on like page 19 and had to stop because it's a different world. So I think Bhaskar's dialectic is going to be like Leibniz. It's probably going to take 300 years to digest, and then somebody in the future will be able to kind of apply
If
it.
it makes you feel better, his partner Hillary Wainwright said she didn't understand a word of it. So yeah,
Right.
anyway, and
Yeah.
she was like, yeah,
Right. So I think no, I agree. I think the point is that these shifts in conceptual thinking about new technological forms, new economic structures, new military, forms, etc. I think these shifts in the realm of ideas, in many ways precipitate the practical political shifts, right? So Lenin's political form of the party-army anticipated October 17. In other words, it was the most necessary and organically kind of necessary political organizational form for Russian politics of October 17th. The organizational form emerged decades before it had the opportunity, through historical chance and et cetera, or whatever you want to say, to actualize itself at the right time, at the right moment. But had that organizational form not existed, it couldn't have been improvised, I think, in the heat of the moment, because it was the result of a very carefully digested, as we know, and I think that's true for all revolutionary political forms that have succeeded in achieving political power, including on the capitalist side, So I think, yeah.
Okay, and I was just going to say, I think maybe what would help is we didn't assign this, but it's in the book. It's at the beginning, the introduction, 1980 to the second edition of the book, and it's called The Scientific Discourse, Knowledge as a Commodity. And he gives you a prospectus on the book. It kind of gives you the idea of the ambition and the scope of the book. The essays are an attempt at translation and integration. They're not set out to translate between some of the many dialects of the discourse of science in our culture, and as a result, bring together concepts and traditions which are generally associated with quite distinct fields of study in the modern organization of language. So this transdisciplinary approach, which Wilden was very well known for, which Lacanian psychoanalysis, as the master discourse was famous for, is part of the ambition here. The synthesis sought is necessarily both ongoing and open-ended. The integration desired requires an active, critical, and transcending perspective, and a perspective open to understanding the deep structures which unite all the disciplines, right? Using the Chomskyan language in quotation marks, both ideologically and epistemologically, as well as a perspective open to comprehending the communication between vested interests, which are ultimately responsible for the seemingly psychic splitting of the subject in academia today. So again, this is a major intervention into creating disciplinary, unlocking disciplinary boundaries in the name of a liberating knowledge, a new liberating epistemology. So, and he speaks about, the interdisciplinary approach at length. So I think maybe we should, we could get a lot out of this, at least the first 4 or 5 pages of this, real and material telonomic, but not teleological processes of history. The Marxist model has one scientific and epistemological quality which other socio-political and socio-economics theories lacks. It rarely fails to be concerned with the context, and again, context bound, in which change occurs. And I think this is something we're trying to do, and with Wilden is very good. It is a systemic and structural model open to the environments, including the future, and a set of truths in process which are derived from studying deep structure constraints and the systematic processes of the system itself, the going back to an older language, socioeconomic system itself, not by the aggregation, as it was, of information from other disciplines. So it's very interesting. These truths are not, or try not to be, derivations from any set of rationalizations seeking to justify the actual state of the system in question at time. Of all the approaches, the Marxist perspective is truly scientific, and this is interesting in that it is critical, self-critical, transdisciplinary orientation, an orientation which is also capable of explaining its own relation to the context it's in. Right? So I think this is very important. Again,
I think this. So I think this is very.
Yeah.
I think this is very important to notice as a background. I mean, on a very crude level, because as we know in this chapter, Wilden makes this fundamental distinction between the analog and the digital, which is the difference, the way he says, between continuity, right, and discreteness. And if we take this kind of, to make a very crude analogy to what you just said and what he said about academia and academic silos, that's one of the discretization effects of socialized cybernetics, where it is now commonly assumed to be true and necessary and inevitable that academic specialization is sort of like as inevitable as gravity on Earth, right? Whereas the idea that, under making sense of the world that we live in, whether you're a physicist or a biologist or a political economist, requires not only when necessary the most radical and focused discreteness in your study of focus, but also, right, the maintenance of continuity, of narrative, of historical memory, and etc. within your fields, which are obliterated as an approach to teach. Obviously, they exist in many places, but I'm saying as the general tendency. But I do want to maybe just focus on just 2 pages that I found. They're related to where Michael stopped reading in the chapter for today. And maybe then we can go to some of the more general discussion of cybernetics and maybe some of the ideas that went into the founders of this new science. And, interestingly, Stanisław Lem, the great Polish philosopher and science fiction writer, in his biggest book, which is the Summa Technology, where he speculates about the possible future directions of human civilization in terms of its scientific discourse and etc. He says one of the interesting weak flaws of modern societies, writing this in the late 60s, roughly in the same time as Wilden, is that there's an explosion of new techniques and technologies and ways of forming machines that humans have invented in his time, but the theory that can adequately explain it is lacking, which is kind of an interesting thing that I think Wilden is sort of primarily motivated for. He's trying to make sense, I think, in an interdisciplinary way of what is this new emerging thing called cybernetics, which is making these huge claims that it can organize human life more rationally and thus better than the past 300 years of the European, Enlightenment tradition and liberal capitalist imperial politics.
Arto, before you go to your 2 pages, let me just refer Arvin to the page 157 on the computer in the brain. Von Neumann, the last paragraph, deals in detail with some detail with the question of the analog and the digital in the brain in his Silliman lectures, interrupted by his death in 1958. And he talks about the prima facie digital behavior of the neuron as a simplification. And it is true that neurons emit or do not fire, but this firing may be modified by the recovery time. So anyway, this is a section on what you were talking about, in which he tries to address this notion of the analog and the digital vis-a-vis the body and this neurological project. Just as an aside, right? Since you brought it up, this may add to some depth to the discussion later. But I'll give it back to Arto.
No, I mean, I think it's just, I mean, granted, I think as we read this, it's obvious that a lot of the scientific references, like for example, when he talks about neuroscience in 1959 or neuroscience in 1971 or 5, all that stuff is obsolete and outdated. Like, I'm not sure how accurate his discussion of neurons and the analogies that he makes would be today, because obviously a lot has changed. So I'm not going to really engage with those parts, or the parts where he talks about biology or various studies of like in biology of microorganisms and other creatures. But I think there are pages here that are very enlightening for me, at least in terms of how do we make sense of the digital and the analog, the way cybernetics has forced us to think about it in the field of politics or the political. How do we make sense of it in terms of questions of political power and the functioning of everyday life, in politics, and all of its extensions. Obviously, in alliance with the constant shifts in the capitalist economic structures, right, that are part of the political. So on page 161, I think 161 to 163, I found interesting to read in that sense. So I just want to read maybe together just a few sections from there, because I think this is, I think, the section in the chapter, or one of the main sections of the chapter, where he tries to wrestle with, like, what is the meaning of this thing called cybernetics that everybody's going crazy over in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and artificial intelligence, and what is that? And so, and of course, it's not surprising that the section is called Distinctions in Logical Form, because the distinctions in the logical form are going to have fundamental importance in the functioning, right, in the movement from the abstract to the concrete, if you incorporate this logical form to guide your actions, you're gonna engage and produce certain particular actions that are going to be different depending on the logical form that inform your fundamental concepts that are motivating your actions and ways of thinking and making sense of what is it that you're doing. Whether you are a cybernetician and you're working on what is artificial intelligence, or whether you are a CEO who has now been told that there's something called, artificial intelligence powered chatbots, and how are you going to implement that in order to increase your return on capital invested for the owners of the corporation. And I read something today from McKinsey Research, the big management, advisory company, market research company, and they're inventing new concepts related to artificial intelligence that has to do with how to humanize technical support operations, how to, more, like, I forget the name of the made up term. I'll remember and I'll bring it up next time, but it was incredible. Like, sort of like near human like communications, So page 163, distinctions in logical form. So he says here, so let's just read some of these sections. Page 161, on the bottom of page 161. So he says, so now we have a summary of the analog versus digital distinction again. Since the analog computer employs continuous linear quantities to represent other quantities, because that's what analog machines are. Think of an old school radio, or think of an old school record player, right? The needle that drops on the actual record fits into the grooves, and the grooves that are physically cut into the record, into the vinyl, if we take an electron microscope and we zoom into it, we will literally see a waveform that's literally etched physically into the vinyl. And when that's rotated a certain speed and with a particular needle of the record player touches it, there is basically that physical, what is the groove represent? Well, it's a physical representation of what was 3 months ago, a sound that was performed, emitted by a piano, that was captured through technology, analog technology. That energy was transformed from sound waves into literal physical representation of that sound wave on a physical medium, in this case, vinyl. But the point is, there's one-to-one or very nearly one-to-one continuous mapping between the sound waves that the piano emitted. And if you translate that into a waveform that's physically drawn on a vinyl, that's basically going to have the same continuity. That song on the vinyl is literally continuous. There's literally one continuous wave without any breaks. The only break happens at the beginning or the end. That's analog technology, right? Or in Wilden, and also he's summarizing kind of a commonly accepted way of thinking about it. The cyberneticians would kind of describe analog devices. So continuous linear quantities to represent other quantities. So how do you represent audio, sound waves that are audible to the human ear that were performed in a space? How do you represent that in some other useful way to humans? Well, one other way to do it is to permanently capture, right, this human audible waves that some musician performed because they performed it very beautifully and whatever. How do you? Well, you do it through this kind of analog technology. So you invent something that converts that kind of sound wave energy into ultimately it has to go through electricity. It has to go through different types of conversion of that energy. So it's stored, right, in a certain way. So then it can be reproduced again in a sound form that some other human can hear. Well, that way of the analog way of doing that, he says, would require the employment of continuous linear quantities to represent other quantities, such as the quantity of a recording being heard in a concert hall. There are no significance gaps in the system. Why? Because the technology can do it. Equally important, there's no true zero. At zero, the machine is off. So this is, I'm going to continue making the references to analog recordings in audio. If you overload an audio recording, if you feed an analog recording device, like a tape machine, a signal that is very, very loud, and it's so loud that it's beyond the design kind of capabilities, you're going to get something that doesn't sound right. It's off. But the results are actually going to be, for many people who enjoy that kind of recording technique, pleasant. You're going to get distortion, but it's analog. It's Jimi Hendrix playing the electric guitar. The electrical signal that's a continuous waveform that's emitted by his guitar is literally, if we look at it a representation of it, it's jagged and it's being destroyed. Why? Because he's playing it so loud. The signal is being amplified in such a way that it's being damaged, if you will. You're not really hearing the guitar anymore. You're hearing this horrific thing, which is called distorted Jimi Hendrix sound. But there's no off there. You still hear this glorious sound that now we call, rock music, right? And it's embryonic stage. He says, all the quantities involved in analog technology or by an analog machine are positive. There are no minus quantities. So he's basically making a distinction here between the way a digital computer, for example, represents some other desirable phenomena, right? By breaking it into discontinuities, which are represented ultimately in electricity through discrete changes in the voltage. It's on, off, or it's more or less, but they're very kind of distinct changes in the electrical circuit, including literal physical interruptions. Right? So the next page, 162, these quantities represented are relatively imprecise. The digital computer, on the other hand, depends upon the combination of discrete elements made possible by its on-off processes. Okay, that's fine. He's just summarizing, right, the way a digital circuit works, because that's the nature. I mean, that's how we figured out to represent a sound wave that we hear with our ears, which is an analog device to a large extent, because it hears whatever we can hear through this non-stop stream, continuous stream of perception. In other words, we don't hear music by consciously or unconsciously listening 44,000 times a second to the sound wave as discrete little 44,000 individual discrete points per second, and then our brain kind of recomputes these 44,000 discretely heard pieces of music each second into something that sounds continuous. We don't do that. The ear just perceives the music the way it is without the necessity for such kind of laborious and primitive ways of approximating something that is happening in the natural world. But the computer does it. And to our ear, when the computer does it, to our ear, when you hear something played on your iPod, sounds completely continuous and organic. Well, because it's been pushed back into the domain of human hearing, and our hearing apparatus is based on continuous intake of stimulus of that kind. Because physically, the inner ear, that if we go on the level of the anatomy, there's an apparatus that converts that kind of energy into ultimately electrical signals in our brain. It can respond in a continuous form, The digital computer, on the other hand, depends on the combination of discrete elements made possible. Okay, zero is essential to it. And since its combinatorial possibilities depend only upon the placing and the ordering of its discrete elements rather than upon their nature of their location as such, the digital computer can represent negative quantities. Its representations are relatively precise. Okay, so that's not really useful or applicable to what is socialized cybernetics, or how is cybernetics going to be the new form of liberalism or the new form of making sense of the capitalist economy or whatever. That's just a description of how perhaps a computer can make sense of information. But it introduces these important ideas of continuity and discrete and well-defined boundaries interruptions. And if we stay on the level of metaphors as an aid to our critical thinking about, for example, contemporary transformations in the corporate structure of the capitalism, or if we want to think about the warfare, continuity and discreteness may become useful heuristics for making sense of, or even initially describing, some social phenomena. The tension between a continuous system versus a system of the same type that is functioning in through discrete way of organizing itself in some way. So I think he's emphasizing this difference, and I think this is important to think about, whether we think about it in terms of logic. I mean, if you want to think about Hegelian logical categories, or the transformation of the particular, the singular, and the universal, I mean, Hegel himself talks about it. There's questions of boundaries, of limits. People talk about the limits to capitalism. So I think questions of discreteness versus continuity in our study of time and the political structure as temporal structures, there's a lot of interesting possibilities that begin to emerge if you follow that heuristic. Okay, next paragraph. So page 162. The analog computer maps continuums precisely, whereas the digital computer can only be precise about boundaries. if we pull away from the level of circuits of humans programming human-created digital machines, this can also perhaps be an interesting heuristic. The digital computer can only be precise about boundaries. So if we shift to big data through artificial intelligence powered production systems, what does it mean that artificial intelligence based production systems that produce cars and cell phones and customer service or begin to teach courses in college, they can only deliver precision to other humans only when it comes to different boundary conditions in science or knowledge or descriptions of or simulated understandings of human reality. I don't know, to me that becomes an interesting enough potential question about how do we think the digital in when applied to questions of political structures or temporal structures that function in important ways for human organization of life, or the latest shifts in the functioning of speculative fictitious capital. The units of communication or computation in the analog machine may in principle be repeatedly divided without necessarily losing their signification or use, whereas those in the digital computer cannot be divided below the level of the discrete unit on which it depends. I think that's an interesting sentence too, about if we want to push this notion of what happens when cybernetics begins to function through political ideology or sense-making apparatus for organizing or maintaining the existing class structure. Why? Well, and the gaps cannot be, the direct analog computer is a concrete iconic representation of the behavior it maps. So now he's introducing the word behavior, right? I think he's trying to pull us away now from the strict cybernetics of computer science and related machinery to maybe its social dimensions. Once those machines and that logic of organizing life as a machine of that type begins to take hold in politics. The direct analog is a concrete iconic representation of the behavior it maps. The digital computer is an entirely abstract, arbitrary, and more merely linguistic representation. It employs an artificial language. What happens when human language is made deliberately to degenerate into an artificial recombination or reconstitution of previous human language? What happens when the jargon of cybernetics becomes common sense? Wilden seems to argue you're going to have less and less precise language, more and more precise language, because you're going to get more and more artificially reconstituted or distilled forms of human language, right? And there's there's a good passage I want to quote a bit in a second about how one of the big enemies of these early theorists of cybernetics was human language itself, because they said the problem with human language is it's insufficiently precise. It has multiple meanings. A particular word or a sentence can have multiple meanings depending on context. It's context dependent, and context cannot very well be predetermined and pre-conceptualized. And thus, it can be modeled, but it must have already happened. But humans constantly act and do things based on things that haven't really happened before, especially in decisive moments in human politics.
If I could, I just wrote something, vis-a-vis later for the semester on socialized cybernetics, which I did for this course. Cybernetized public space is the logical outcome of postmodernism, in that discourse is shattered, truth is indiscernible, and relativism becomes the new norm. Yeah. In some ways. So this is kind of my little short contribution to this discussion. Yeah. What happens when the digital takes over, when we lose metaphor, when we lose, the analog.
When we lose metaphor, when we lose the open-ended nature of what is it being to be human, meaning right. The notion that it is possible, if you are under brutal occupation and you're completely dehumanized and you're called a cockroach, which all genocidal politics, at least in the recent history that I'm familiar with in the last 100 years, all genocidal policies always used these same words to denote the targeted population slated for extermination. You know, cockroaches, rats, you know, etc.
Including Kafka.
Including what?
Including Franz Kafka in the Metamorphosis, Gregor Samsa, transformed.
So once,
yeah,
in the Metamorphosis, right? The great meditation. Once you do that, you know, how are you going to resist that? Well, you must be able to believe that this is not the end. Like, you have to dig in and say, well, you know, I may do something extremely irrational. You know, if I'm in the Warsaw Ghetto, for example, in the middle of the 1940s, and I will go to my certain death, but because I believe that you know, and I mean, there's no need to even make the super obvious references to what's going on today in the world, or what happened, you know, et cetera, in different parts where genocidal politics. Well, yeah. I mean, Arvind, to your comment, you know, the Nazis tried, and maybe they were prevented from using the benefit of the digital computer because they lived right before it, right? They used IBM Hollerith punch card machines, right? Which were kind of initial. I mean, they were digital machines, you know, but they were not. I guess they were prototypical digital computers, but without the vast value-added benefits of what is possible today.
Digital thinking without the digital machinery. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. Sorry?
Yeah. Digital thinking without digital machinery.
Right. And in other words, maybe they were a little bit too advanced for their time, and thankfully, well, I mean, they certainly, yeah. But I think they showed the way. I don't know if that makes sense. It's a horrible thing to say. You know, I think they showed the way. I think they learned from the British Empire, as we know, in all of its colonies, but particularly in the southern part of Africa, in the Boer Wars and the concentration camps. But they showed the way. And I think when it happens again, it's going to be much worse. It's just like warfare. I think as we continue to live in the age of you know, simulated thinking machines and hyper-industrial production of drones or everything, the next World War is going to be exponentially much more destructive than the previous World War. And the next genocide organized by a highly technical, digitally armed imperial power is going to be much more destructive in terms of the body count than the previous genocide. I think that's the terrifying possibility opened up by capitalist and the fusion of capitalist economic structures, imperial power, and modern technology. You know, so I think all these stories in the 1990s where people said we're in the age of new smart wars with smart weapons, where there's going to be no collateral damage and we don't need big militaries because they'll be surgically, you know, only the necessary military. That was total ideological smokescreen. I think they were fully prepared and fully cognizant of the fact that the next systemic war between systemic players in global politics is going to be much more destructive than World War II. And I think we're starting to see, unfortunately, just a little taste of how 1,000-kilometer front line in the Ukraine between NATO and Russia, with very few forces involved. In World War II, that same 1,000-kilometer front line would have millions of troops concentrated against each other. Today, we have arguably in the southern part of Ukraine battlefront, in the Zaporozhye area, you know, where the Ukrainian counteroffensive was, we're talking about at most 150,000 on either side. But look at the loss of life that has happened, right? At least 100,000 Ukrainians, and if the ratio that some of the more knowledgeable people are writing about are correct, of 6-to-1 or 8-to-1, it's also the tens of thousands of Russians as well. But that kind of killing is happening with with exponentially less numbers of bodies fighting. But of course, they're complemented by many more machines and controlled by people. And of course, the much more terrifying numbers of weapons that are being shot at each other, right? So Israel dropped on Gaza, in terms of the tonnage of bombs, in the 2 weeks of intense bombing, I forget exactly the number, more greater tonnage of bombs than in the war of 1973 or something, which was a high intensity war between two mechanized armies, right? And here we have a bombing campaign by a hyper-industrial army against essentially lightly armed guerrillas. The tonnage of bombs dropped in a very short amount of time is exponentially greater than what was dropped over a far greater area over a far longer time period. So that's the terrifying potential unlocked by technology and kind of the tools of the trade, if you will. So, but the Nazis, of course, showed the way. As we'll see when we read the Nazi management techniques, they figured out a way to efficiently discharge political power, whether that political power was meant to kill people physically, to work people in labor camps most efficiently, to wage war against another military, or to organize the vacation schedules of its workers on the vacation homes on the Baltic Sea, the giant complexes that the Nazis built of, copying the Soviet, rest homes, for the workers. So just to finish this before, because I do want to get into these quotes before finish too. I'm sure Michael and everybody else. Does anybody have any comments, by the way, or before we read the next section, or things they wanted to say? Phil wrote.
Yeah,
Phil,
one thing I mean, I'm a rather mundane thing. I know in music, and Michael's probably aware of this, in terms of digital technology, that the analog, there are purists who basically swear by vinyl, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
Okay. And they do have a point. There is a difference. I can hear the difference, but where I can't hear the difference is the digital technology has now caught up, and in the area of high res music, where it is difficult to tell the difference. That issue really isn't the important one. The important one is the way when we talk about metaphor and the way the ambiguity that's inherent within human language, that is what is missing from digital technology.
Yeah. And
it is a good recording medium in terms of the past, but if we're going to talk about the future, and this basically I think concerns, I'm not sure if it concerns the issue of boundary that Wilden talks about. I don't think so. But this is there is this tension, I don't know how to put it, that you can take ChatGPT, you can write a paper, but the paper in some sense does not, it can't get at that level of ambiguity. And that's something that's missing, that now on the other hand, what happens when we are no longer capable of noticing the difference? That's where it becomes frightening. So
yes. I'm in perfect agreement with you. That is the frightening aspect. Why I wrote, relativism becomes the norm, right? Mm-hmm. In a sense, the discourse is no longer really discourse, right? It's indescribable in a certain way. And ultimately, I think you make great points here. And it's really in some ways that the metonymic, in digital has overtaken the metaphoric, right? In a way, and we've lost the ability to think in metaphoric, and therefore the movement of the dialectic becomes more and more static, in a sense. That this digitalization leads to a kind of stasis in motion because of the lack of the metaphorics and the metaphoricity that is not there. And I think you make a great point about listening to the grooves and the backing off. Yes, you can get the high resolution in digital, but in some ways you really are missing the ambiguity by not listening to the original, cut, etc. I was listening yesterday to KCR did the old vinyl Clifford Brown and Max Roach at the Continental Restaurant about a week before Clifford Brown died in the automobile crash. And you can just hear so much more. It's amazing, in a very, very weak record from 56, right? and the grooves that you're getting, that you get if this was remastered. Hopefully it is remastered and more accessible to people, because it's hard to get. But in a sense, yeah, think about this. Yeah.
I totally agree. I mean, and with
yeah,
Michael and Patrick, and your point, I mean, I think the point about the grooves and the vinyl and the digital, I think that as a basic illustration of sort of what he means, the basic distinction between the analog and the digital. But I think you're right. I think digital technology has, and you can imagine digital audio in 100 years. I mean, the sampling rates they'll develop a completely different way of representing the physical airwave, and it already is completely almost indistinguishable. But I think it's this originary kind of, and of course, at that point, the point is, what if we can't tell the difference? And what is the meaning of us not being able to tell the difference? And this kind of originary moment, the originary moment of wonderment, perhaps is going to make, but so I don't know. I think your points are absolutely, you pointed the fundamental, distinction here. And I think he's kind of with you in the next paragraph, although I could be wrong. The middle of page 162 and the very top of 163, or I'm not sure. That's the sense I'm getting. But if we read it, it says, it is impossible to represent the truth functions of symbolic logic in an analog computer. Now, I don't know if I'm not a mathematical logician, so I'm taking his word as being true. It is impossible to represent the truth functions of symbolic logic. So yeah, symbolic logic has developed a systematized way of determining what is, right? What is true. And what is not true, it's not, right? So if we want to make this kind of, the truth is that which is, right? Whereas somebody who doesn't look at the world or doesn't make sense of the world through symbolic mathematical logic can say, yeah, this is, or that's not, right? But he says, the truth functions of symbolic logic in analog computer, because the analog computer cannot say not a, right? Because it doesn't function that way. That's not part of its ontology. Negation in any language or simulated language depends upon syntax, which is a special form of combination. And the analog computer has no syntax beyond the level of pure sequence in a positive direction. It just is. Kind of the sequence just goes until it stops. And once it stops, it's no longer it, right? There is no either or in terms of the logical operators for the analog computer, because everything in it is only more or less. That is to say, everything in it is both and, right? The analog computer cannot represent nothing, something that's not a thing. The analog computer only represents things that are, right? Because it is directly or indirectly related to things, whereas the language, and I thought this was the most interesting sentence, whereas the language of the digital computer is essentially autonomous and arbitrary in relation to things. And to me, this was the thing that made me uncomfortable about the possibilities that the digital opens up if it's used in a certain way. That the language of the digital computer is essentially autonomous and arbitrary in relation to things. This is why the CEO, the chief scientist of Google, said a couple of years ago that Google software doesn't need to know Chinese to be able to translate Chinese flawlessly to humans.
Yeah.
It is not interested in sense making. And maybe that's a problem for me, because I'm a 21st century person who grew up who's, I guess, more conditioned to not think about the digital in this way. Maybe to the 29th century or the 25th century people, this is going to be very banal and passé, But this idea that the language of the digital computer is essentially autonomous and arbitrary in relation to things. The analog computer is an icon or an image of something real, whereas the digital computer's relationship to reality is rudimentary, similar to language itself. In fact, we can say that in human communication, all non-conventionalized gesture language, posture, I think this is what Michael was saying, right? Facial expression, inflection, sequence, rhythm, cadence, and indeed the context within which human communication takes place is a type of analog or iconic communication in which the signal or sign has a necessary relation to what it represents, whereas all denotative linguistic communication is arbitrary and digital. So I think I don't know if it's useful to make an analogy or if it's insightful to take this and as something to keep in mind as we try to make sense of changing forms of political subjectivity influenced by cybernetic representation of human beings as human created computing machines. That's the recursive remixing, right, of Descartes, I think, therefore I am, or Martin Luther, right? I believe in God only by understanding my faith or the basis of my faith, right? That was Deleuze said that was the revolutionary moment of Martin Luther in the Protestant Reformation, is he said, yeah, believe in the religious teachings, but only through understanding them, rather than through obedience of the custom and the learned language and the body of going to the service, and you just do the thing, and once you do it, you believe the authority of the already existing eternal Catholic Church. Here we have kind of like maybe the remixing in the cybernetics. Yes, it's better to be a human being by being supplemented and augmented through other human being created machines that simulate in a better way what you're supposed to be, right? So that's basically the I think the starting premise of cybernetic of the fundamental theorists of cybernetics, that I hope to get to some of those quotes later. But Michael or anybody else?
Yeah, I was just going to add a footnote. Of course, Heidegger was horrified in his last interview with machine translations, right? He really couldn't take this, that the machine was capable of translating from one language to another, because it lost the, quote, what he would call the spirit of the language or the poetics of the language. And this is something, again, that the digital, loses. Another thing you could think about too is, the popularity of hip hop and when it came in terms of context. I'm not against hip hop as a rebellion, but unlike good progressive jazz, bebop, hard bop, and other forms that you, Patrick, and I know very well, and probably other people here too, that the hip hop revolution, if you will, or the hip hop reaction in the Bronx, in a sense, was really a metonymic function, right? It did not really move along the lines of metaphorics or that dialectical in some ways, right? It was much more of a digital form than an analog form. So, I mean, I'm just hypothesizing here. I'd have to think about it more. But I do think that what happened in popular music is that, the dialectical idea of music, the type of what Adorno used to call regressive hearing, began to take place. I mean, and I like Wu-Tang Clan, but it's all filled with metonymics. It's not so much, a metaphoric approach. And you can see this, the lack of counterpoint, jazz too, that became fusion in the 80s. So this new context that emerges after Wilden's writing this in 72, in the middle 70s, late, all the way until today, this kind of new digitalization of music. You can speak to this, but I'm just riffing here. This is an intuitive grasp, I think, of what he's saying vis-a-vis. Yeah, go ahead, please.
I mean, what I was thinking of is that if we are to believe and follow the sort of the mavens of today, I mean, the who declare that the primacy of, I mean, what is the phrase? Math is not emotional, and math, like there's like a phrase that you hear often on in various contexts at like TED Talks and made by technologists and et cetera, the sense that the new ground of the human experience is mathematics, right? Or formal logic, in the sense that whatever mathematics can define to be true is, whatever that mathematics can present through its models as true logically, is essentially the starting point for further sense making in human life and in human kind of activities. So in the sense that mathematics, formalized kind of mathematical logic has replaced, certainly in the minds of the sort of leading cybernetics infused capitalists who have political power, whether it's the Thiels of PayPal and the Gateses and the mavens, who own or who lead the top 7 corporations with the largest capitalization in the U.S., S&P 500 index, which drive, according to the Wall Street Journal today, are basically the sole reason why of the good news that's in the S&P 500. It's basically the wonderful 7, Google's, the Microsofts, the Apples. So if cybernetics is positing itself as the new godlike structure, the new ground out of which human beings are supposed to make sense of their lives, this sentence about, at the bottom of page 162 and top of 163, where he says, the language of the digital computer is essentially autonomous and arbitrary in relation to things, which allows it to function like a transhistorical, transpolitical, godlike ground to which everything justifies its functioning and rationalization. I think that's one of the moments that's happening in order for cybernetics to become socialized. Once this kind of recentering of what is the ground, but we can get back to that a little bit later. I wanted to bring some quotes here from some of the famous cyberneticians who developed this way of separating the digital and the analog and create this brave new world. I found these quotes in a brilliant book written by a Bulgarian sociologist titled Transhumanism and the Future of Education. She's looking at it from the point of view of education systems, education theory, and etc. Natalia Christova, 2021, and she has these incredible chapter which has these quotes that are so, I think, interesting in this context as both background and also as a springboard for further interrogation on how does cybernetics become socialized cybernetics, and how does Homo economicus potentially start this transformation into Homo datum, So there's an interesting quote by Günther Anders, in his 1956 book, The Obsolescence of Man. Is that how it's translated into English, Michael? The Obsolescence of Man?
Yeah. Hannah Arendt's
Hannah Arendt's
first
husband.
First husband.
Yeah. So Günther Arends was very critical of cybernetics.
1930s, by the way. Yeah.
He was troubled by the people who kind of came together to develop the initial outlines of the science. So according to him, right, they said there was a paradoxical shame which he observed during a technical exhibition, which he said, in fact, was symptomatic of the modern human being, the 1950s. The Promethean shame that man is not up to the things he himself has invented. The promise of the Enlightenment, for example, has not been met. Right? Why? Well, because of World War II and the genocidal events that took place in World War II. Of course, this is a totally kind of imperial, like Anglo-Saxon yearning, because, genocidal killings have been happening for many centuries since then, precipitated by some of the interpretations of the Enlightenment, or the counter-Enlightenment, rather. But according to Günther Anders, he's saying at the heart of this shame that these cyberneticians felt motivated by to act, at the heart of the shame is the pitiful, humiliating feeling that unlike machines that are deliberately made to be in a certain way and not to be in some other ways, right? Human beings, or man, is the accidental, incomplete result of a blind, unpredictable, incalculable, and uncontrollable process of conception and birth. That unlike human-made machines, a person is born, not made. And that's the problem that I think is very much centered in the internal logic of cybernetics, at least the way it originates in capitalist societies after World War II, is that the big problem that needs to be overcome is this part of humanity that is hurt or affected or afflicted by that which is unpredictable, that which is incalculable, that which is uncontrollable. All three in the process of creation, in thinking itself, human creativity, wonderment, all these things that Aristotle fundamentally said are what makes human life human, interesting, and rewarding to live and experience. If you unlock those abilities of you to function in that way. So fundamentally, for Günther Anders, but also I think for Wilden, or I mean, for me, this is like the interesting kind of critique of cybernetics in its initial iteration, perhaps. The problem that cybernetics tries to solve is to filter out, or if that cannot be filtered out, at least to control what Heidegger would call, what is called thinking. That is the problem, because it's not precise enough in this kind of computational, mathematical, in the narrow way, positivist way of obtaining certainty. So it's kind of like a trivial reading of Descartes' quest to clearly delineate what is certainty and what is not. I think Descartes was far more, and Michael, you've studied Descartes much more deeply than I have. This is kind of quest for certainty through this kind of elimination of that which is unpredictable, or control of the unpredictable, maybe through sophisticated probabilistical models and etc. Ignoring of the incalculable. That which cannot be calculated is simply not relevant. It must be cut out because it's not useful. If it's not calculable, if it's incalculable, it's metaphysical and it's outside of the domain of mathematics, and thus it's inaccessible in a meaningful way to us. And of course, all the poets in the world will disagree, right?
Yes.
So the unpredictable.
That's why all the poets started to go mad in the 17th century with the mathematization of nature. Yeah. Folke Granville, I can go through the whole list.
Right.
I'm very interested in madness and mathematics. But
Right.
Anyway.
And I find this Günther Anders's kind of critique interesting. And he says, in his desire to imitate the tools that human beings himself have invented,
Right.
modern man sets himself even higher goals, becoming the subject of a specific engineering through which he attempts to adapt the technical environments that human beings created themselves, overcoming the limitations of our unplastic, unmodelable natural body. So the problem, I think, is not that people are constantly inventing tools to improve something that they face and that they confront. That's not the problem. The problem is what about ourselves that we're trying to improve, and those things are the unplastic, unmodelable part of us needs to be jettisoned, right? So the Enlightenment itself, if you want to define Descartes or Kant's, what is Enlightenment essay and what he brings into there as to how we should aim to live lives that are rewarding, rich, meaningful, etc., as an ideal. Those things are being targeted by cybernetics because those things are just wishful thinking that got us into World War II and the horrific slaughter that resulted thereof. So let's make human life more precise, which means well-defined within particular boundaries that are beyond a doubt, i.e. mathematically shown to be true, i.e. beyond doubt, because they're clearly as human reason can define, defined. And let's not guide our behavior and our actions and our thoughts through yearnings that are uncalculable. If you take this to be a good way to posture the future, or you're thinking about politics or whatever, I think you'll arrive at a perfectly regressive politics or reactionary politics where that is, whatever exists that is well-formed can basically persist forever. Because how are you going to break out of a particular political ideology that's hegemonic? You have to take a leap into the incalculable. It's like when somebody says to you, like in a conversation, I'm watching these elections in Bulgarian politics where there's a woman economist who is now in a surprised kind of runoff election for the capital city mayor position, whatever. The details are not important, but the stakes are high because she's a socialist. And the answers the questions that she's getting are from the capitalist's own media are always the same question. It's like, you are critical of how the education system in public schools is running. You can make the parallel to New York City, of course. Oh, you think that New York City's education is not running well? Okay, it's not running well. We know that. How can we improve it? And if the answer is completely out of the box of that which already exists, then the response is, well, that's not reasonable. That's just pie in the sky. right? So that's the digital kind of thinking, if you will, if you want to use the language of the digital to describe kind of how hegemonic thought tries to maintain itself, right, from its challengers. Well, you're going to say, you're asking us to imagine something that cannot be, that's uncalculable. Like, what do you mean you're going to socialize the means of production? How am I going to buy a cheesecake? How would the cheesecake be produced if the markets are not there in their chaotic vitality to produce signals to the producers and the buyers? You're asking us to do something that is, of course, Soviet cybernetics said you can very well calculate down to the last cent supply and demand questions. This was Ukrainian cybernetician who didn't have his vision of cybernetics implemented in the central planning body. Well, he was convinced that everything can be cybernetically, explained too. So the ultimate goal of this movement, right, to basically overcome the limitations of an unplastic, unmodelable natural body, the ultimate goal of this movement is the transformation of human beings into machines in order to make better human beings. It's a process of reduction. You reduce, you chisel away those human capacities that are not harnessable by mathematical models for various reasons, or simply incalculable at this present moment. Maybe they will be in the future, and then we'll allow them, right? Maybe they'll be in the future, and then we'll allow them, and then you proceed. And then some years earlier, Norbert Wiener, published the book that Michael mentioned, and the science of cybernetics, of course, emerged in the context of World War II, as we said, and right off the bat, it distanced itself from the Enlightenment humanist broadly defined tradition. And there's a quote here by one of the early major forces in cybernetics, Warren McCullough. And Warren McCullough said, look, the quote, "I don't particularly like people. I never liked them. For me, human beings are the nastiest, most destructive of all living things," right? So the question is, how do we introduce progress in the way we live life in ways that we minimize this kind of destructive, self-destructive tendencies going forward? And the solution was cybernetics. And what was cybernetics? There's four, as I understand, it has four main parts initially, defined by the four main theorists who got together in these initial conferences between 1943 and 1954 in order to, the Joshua Macy Foundation sponsored it. Smart capitalists were very interested in these kinds of new intelligent electrical machines. Sorry, there's a comment. So Arvind says, Gunther Anders also wrote about Promethean shame. And Andy Warhol gave expression to that icy saying, "I want to be a machine," a repressed desire that an artist had to give voice to. Yeah, right. And that literally was the phrase, right, Arvind? The Promethean shame that Gunther Anders used. So there were four major figures or four strands that came together to make up what cybernetics is in the early stage. It was theory of information, which was Claude Shannon, one of the main figures. So Shannon went to this conference exchanging notes with McCullough, who dealt with neurons and how the human brain functions. And here's the key point: as an information processing machine. So McCullough's model that the human brain, and thus the human mind, which is the product of the brain, right, he would say, is literally can be best understood as as a computer, as an electrical computer, as an information processing machine that gives birth to the currently dominant models in neuroscience, although they are challenged by, as I understand it, by a small minority that proposes that actually it's kind of foolish to model the human mind as an information processing machine because you're selling yourself really short, right? But nonetheless, cybernetics has this information theory of Shannon's, and there's a juicy quote that I found very revealing by Shannon as well in his motivations. It's just interesting. This is the high point of this kind of post-World War II positivism, faith in happiness through mathematics. unbounded application of mathematics in all fields of life, including political science. If you study political science in most good departments in the United States, you're going to be studying positive political theory. You're going to be studying political processes modeled through set theory, for example, like my wonderful alma mater did and made me do when I was a student at the University of Rochester, political science. Let the set of all members of Congress be this, and then there is a particular mathematical computation from set theory, and then we basically describe a congressional session debating legislature, which in the normal obsolete English language would take you 5 words to describe, or you could use 3 paragraphs of set theory to do it, with less precision actually and meaning. But anyways, so you have information theory, Shannon, you have the model of the brain, and neural networks, neurons functioning as information processing machines. You have von Neumann's work, which was basically the foundation for modern digital computers as digital computing machinery, but not just digital computing machinery, machinery that was based on the idea of code, and this code could suggest that the functioning of those machines can be reproduced, it can be changed. In other words, it could be reproduced like biological systems. So from von Neumann, we have the idea that human-created machines can also be reproduced along ways that biological systems reproduce as well, in that kind of a genealogy and lineage and etc. And then from Wiener, we have the philosophical kind of engagement, that this way of recasting what does it mean to be human can be done. Like there is a philosophy of cybernetics too, which this is why I think, Michael, you find Wiener the most interesting of the early cyberneticians, and you would not really read McCullough from the point of view of understanding the political, but you could find Norbert Wiener's meditations interesting. So what is the result of all of this? The result is, and here's the quote again, from now on, humans must, I think this is Claude Shannon, from now on, humans must first be seen as information processing entities that are intrinsically similar to intelligent machines, he doesn't say, that they themselves created. That's a problematic reduction for me. Like, it seems weird. From now on, humans must first be seen as information processing entities that are intrinsically similar to other machines that human beings created. Thus, cybernetics emerges when control theory meets information theory, summarizing, and the interplay of information, machine control, communication theory, and with an analogy being to reproduction of biological beings. The fusion of the organic and the mechanical, which, by the way, is where we're going absolutely right now. The future, the next 50 years, whether we read enlightened technologists or transhumanists or biologists doing human, machine interaction and interfaces, the fusion of the organic and the cybernetic is happening. But of course, the fundamental question is on what basis and through what purpose, right? So what was this project again? Maybe we can, and I just noticed that we're at the 2-hour mark. Just to frame it again, this is Georges Boulanger, the president of the International Association of Cybernetics at the 3rd Congress, 1961. He said, kind of a programmatic statement about cybernetics. Cybernetics intends to undertake unlimited exploration in the realm of the spirit. It intends to define intelligence and to measure it. So there are very big assumptions there, right? First of all, that you can define intelligence mathematically and concisely through language of formal logic, which means you can define it without any qualification and ambiguity, because otherwise it wouldn't meet the standard of formal logical truth. It intends to define intelligence and to measure it. It will attempt to explain the functioning of the brain and to create thinking machines. So these are major like goals. I mean, to explain the functioning of the brain like good luck with that.
Yeah.
40 years later. And to create thinking machines, good luck with that too, because simulated human intelligence or believable simulation of human intelligence is not necessarily equivalent, although, as Patrick says, maybe it is if we think it is. It doesn't have to be literally, qualitatively the same. There's a human, and I think that's where the politics, right, Patrick, comes in. That's where the questions of political ideology, socialization, and etc. It will help the biologist and the physician as well as the engineer. So these are the new mavens, the truth holders. And then an interesting end of the quote: pedagogy, sociology, economic sciences, law, and philosophy will become essentially dependent on it. And thus they become not the purveyors of truth anymore. They're just secondary derivative lines of inquiry, which of course Heidegger would have opened fire at this point and blown away. Boulanger had been sitting in the same room probably, yes. But
he said in 68, I have a quote of Boulanger from 68, there's probably no area of thought or of man's material activity in which one can say that cybernetics will not sooner or later have a role to play. He said this in May of 68. Yeah, speaking of cybernetics and control. Yeah, so interesting that he goes back to this in a way. Yeah.
So I think there's a real question here. The first question is, what is lost when we're allowed to, when the complex nature, of the human condition to be reduced to a bunch of sophisticated, but ultimately purely abstract models of that human nature, if you want to use that language. What is lost? Or the question is, what is lost when that reduction happens and is believed to be some concrete manifestations of human life rather than most violent abstractions? So I think this is one of the questions that bothers me and kind of I'd like to pursue more. The real problem is what happens when millions of people start assuming the abstraction of themselves into models that are indistinguishable from any other digital model, whether it's human or whether it applies to human life or machinic life or some other non-human biological life. When that reduction, and thus when everything else is lost, when that reduction becomes accepted as common sense, we are in the terrain of homo datum and socialized cybernetics, and that's a new type of politics. It's a new type of alienation, if you will, to use the Marxist language, new type of proletarianization. But the parameters of what is lost and why that's bad, I don't know. But I have a sense that if it happens under the captains of industry, it's not going to lead to something good. And Phil says it produces the explosion of delusion. So I think that's, there's a few other ideas, but I'm going to reserve them for next time because there are a few other things, quotes from Shannon and which deal with language and his hostility to language and how language had to be decontextualized, and thus computer socialized cybernetic is purely decontextualized. It's purely ahistorical by design, as a good thing. So
I think for next week we should continue with the Wilden. I think it's and you did a great job of introducing another aspect of it and working with it. Maybe we should continue with the reading of the analog and the digital, because he gets into some philosophical methodology, especially the notion of the Aufhebung and Hegel, and how that plays out later, in terms of the relevé, the lifting to a higher plane, versus that of negation, denial, disavowal in the Freudian psychoanalytic language, and how this, can be somewhat oriented back to the analog, but how it's very different in the digital, right? And this zero plus and the negative, the integers that he speaks with Frege. So we could have a very good discussion about this as well, going forward, for a greater understanding of what some of the philosophical stakes are too, especially from the Hegelian and really in a way Spinoza's Marxist, Hegelian Spinoza's Marxist language and its applicability, and also to look more at maybe we can have a discussion, Arto, more about the politics and the politicization of cybernetics, how much more there is to it, right? In a sense, how it's really worked in so many fields as we go forward.
I mean, we should totally do that. And just before I forget, like it seems to be
sure.
so I think engagement with cybernetics, which has left the lab and is functioning more and more politically as an ideology, dominant ideology, requires engagement with the logical forms. So in other words, if we are in the terrain of counter systemic politics or critical thought, or broadly in the Marxist tradition, and etc., or you don't have to be, you can just be simply dissatisfied with what capitalist reality offers us, right, as people, as human beings. In order to confront that reality, one of the pillars of that reality is the absolute dominant position in the field of logical systems, of formal mathematical logic, in making sense of the political and the economic, right? Because modern economics is just purely formal models that are seen and accepted as truth. At least that's what or maybe they pretend that to be the case, right? So the first pillar that this kind of line of inquiry exposes is that to be critical of capitalism today, or whatever, technocratic feudalism, as Varoufakis would say, we live under, one of the ways to do counter-systemic critique of this would be also engagement with the system of logic that underpins it. And that means we need a good critique why formal logic, when applied to the political, is not really useful. These critiques have been made before, right? But they were kind of lost in the last 20 to 30 years, so they'd have to be remade in a way that's directly relevant to our present condition. That's one critical kind of line of thinking that needs to be, that's one type of work that needs to be done in order to undermine the hegemony of the.
If I could make a suggestion for reading, that Henri Lefebvre, through instructions of the French Communist Party, wrote a book called Dialectical Logic, in which he distinguishes and he lays out the parameters of formal logic, and then engages dialectical logic against formal logic. It's a very, very accessible book, I think. Very, very interesting.
And also another area of the struggle in terms of the world of ideas that are counter-systemic also would have to be this notion of thinking about aesthetics, thinking about words like meaning, and maybe that, because how else can we tell the difference, or what our position should be on whether analog, high-end analog, hi-fi reproduction systems are really that meaningful anymore when digital audio technology has reached levels which are nearly or completely indistinguishable in terms of the final result. Well, then how do we critique, or how do we engage with the phenomena of the digital constantly improving in terms of meaningfully perceived and pleasantly sounding recordings of John Coltrane that are now delivered in the digital domain, which has overtaken this kind of beautiful, organic, continuous technology of reproduction that the analog record gives us. So the aesthetic dimension of the political struggle, which was previously also richly part of the political critique of capitalism, needs to be reignited again, specifically through engaging with these advances of the digital. Arvind says, Wiener saw cybernetics as a way to reassert the human, but was skeptical if it would happen. Arto, you're saying now we need to transcend cybernetics due to the failure of the Wienerian transcendence that was foreseen. I'm saying that as an initial step, I think Wiener is perhaps less influential today in the practical applications of cybernetics than, for example, people like McCullough and Shannon. I think the Wiener dimension is maybe kind of forgotten by the captains of industry, and they are far more interested in the program and the possibilities, for example, relative language and how its problematic nature should be sidestepped or improved upon, etc., coming more from the notions that human beings are nothing but very sophisticated and very powerful information processing machines. If that is your answer to the question, what does it mean to be human? you are really presenting a vision of human life and the political that's extremely reductionist and thus reactionary and thus pregnant with all kinds of exclusionary politics, non-egalitarian politics, and because those possibilities are there, racism and genocide, because those are the chief enablers, as we know, of maintaining class-based societies, right? So I think Wiener is not the sense for me, just entering this field of study. I'm not saying this with any confidence, built from many years of closely studying this stuff yet, but I think Wiener is less important today than some of the other people that he was working with. I think this kind of philosophical reflection that he was engaged in is dismissed probably now as things that are of second or third order of interest. And what's interesting is the operationalized things that can be concretely, in their view, concretely, meaning they can be really implemented in actual life, which are actually the most profound abstractions of human life. So I think Shannon, I think information theory and whatever its current transformations and extensions, I think the total domination of the model of the human mind and neuroscience, not neuroscience, but the human mind as a very, very powerful computational machine. I think those are the problems those are the critiques of those ways of thinking about what does it mean to be human need to be made. And of course they are being made, but in view of the emerging new subjectivity of Homo datum, which is the next phase of generalized proletarianization. I mean, if you look at the political class, that's the visible layer, right, of political power. I think Varoufakis made this point. I've been watching Varoufakis because I want to read his new book. He says basically, think about the personalities who have executive power in the European Union today. Think about if they're the representatives of the ruling class, which they are technically speaking, right? That's their function. Von Leiden, Michel's, the chief diplomat Borrell. If you think about their functioning and relative to the war between NATO and Russia, the statements that they're making, their level of political statesmanship, by the standards of Wilden's time, it's shocking. It's incredibly primitive, I don't know what word to use, if incredibly proletarianized. There's a loss of the sense of what is diplomacy. There's loss of the sense of what even basic tact of addressing the media or addressing your political opponents, right? I think when I watch these people talking about their political opponents, I'm hearing a language of extreme abstraction. I'm hearing, conceptions of the political that are so far away from reality that they can only be described as as political models that function analogous to the economic models that didn't predict the last economic depression or crash, and the economic models that failed to predict those crashes. The human use of human beings. That's the famous quote, and it's kind of it's an interesting quote which has multiple dimensions, but it's problematic. The human use of human beings. That doesn't suggest faith in the fundamental nature of human beings being good, being human beings being geared to, collaboration, suggesting that human beings have the autonomy by default of being taken seriously by themselves. Let's hear the others, all of the other traits of approaching what does it mean to be human. This is not suggestive of any kind of line of thinking.
But you were seeing the momentum already and maybe pushing back at it. I mean, just,
I agree. I think he's the most simple. I think he's the most interesting and the most closest to us. I think he's, and in his opposition to the hydrogen bomb, and I think maybe he did what Einstein did when Einstein said the atomic bomb is possible, but I won't help you make it, to kind of crudely paraphrase him. I think I agree, Arvin. I think Wiener's position is probably analogous to Einstein on the atomic bomb. Ultimately, like, you can take this where you're taking it, but I'm going to sound the warning, and I'm not going to be an active participant in it. Yeah. So I think in that sense,
one would have to also look at how this whole moment was capitalized, right? How it became in the hands, as many of us know today, Ray Diallo and Mercer and what's his name, Simon's Renaissance Technologies, how this quantitative analysis is going on Wall Street, creating these huge fortunes, Cambridge Analytica, all of these things that are the outgrowth of what you talk about, the branch of IT, of McCullough, as you pointed out, in a sense, because Wiener, I don't think, is responsible for that. I think he was too much immersed in, and his friends were philosophers, at Harvard as well when he was at MIT, and Struick, who was an outspoken Marxist. I mean, they tried to get him during the McCarthy period. So I think it's important we could also look in a way how this was not only instrumentalized, and you can talk about the human use of human beings that way, which I think Lyotard, picks up on when he says there's no more use value, there's only exchange value. But to really look at how this has turned into, for profit, how it's created this vast technological capital moment, right? That is only 30 years in the making. Remember, the FANG economy are all new companies. They're not the captains of American industry or anything like that. IBM, Xerox, these companies have gone by the wayside. Electronic data systems, Sperry Rand. I grew up with that kind of technology, and then it morphs to the Microsofts, to the Apples, to the Googles, to the Meta, and just even thinking of the language at work here too. How it's created this digital language, and where I think it's very important, this new syntax, if you want to go to Verifakis' techno-feudalism, is kind of interesting because a new nominalism is created, a new nomenclature, if you will, for all of this, that does not allow us to have the groove anymore, or the analog, the use of metaphor, the analog Lacan and Plato is gone, in a sense. That's where analogy comes from, is the Platonic dialogues, right? In a sense, the analogy of the bees, the analogy of the color and shape and the Meno. All of these things are, I think, very, very important for us today. So we should look at capital structure too, how bio-capital and, of course, cyber capital really works, right? I think this would be important, to develop. Yeah, I mean, I hear it at the subjectivity level. I think one question we should have, and I know the subtitle of the seminar has been the emerging contours of new emerging subjectivities. Is subjectivity really relevant anymore? In terms of where we're going, or can we be more pessimistic? Do we need a new language of the subject, or what is really happening here? Yeah, how do we describe this? Because the Stieglerian language is one of disindividuation, right? He doesn't use language like subjectivity, and other thinkers are trying to think beyond that. But anyway, I'm just opening up some fields of force here, if you will. Yeah.
And I mean, and of course, it's like a challenge. This challenge has been thrown in the face of the world, if you will, by the revolutionary transformations of cybernetics, and centered in the victors of World War II. The United States was the main victor, of World War II. And the capitalist class has taken about 30 years or so, 40 years to fully harness it. But if you think about contemporary finance capital, I mean, it has no use of people, in the sense that at its pure, if we reduce their capital accumulation models to the purest mathematical, most maybe reductionist elegant form, it's just a quantity that has to increase on its own, right? In the sense that it's just a mathematical operation, and if any way they can get that to happen, they're more than willing to do it. And if they can do that with machines with minimum of human impact, even more so. And so the implication is modern finance, highly speculative. I mean, the cryptocurrency industry, where I did this as an experiment. I want to understand crypto stuff better. So I installed a trading bot, because you can do that. It's all free, of course, a lot of the software. And I got firsthand kind of inside look at the basics of how fictitious capital can work effortlessly in using modern cybernetic technology. So basically, somebody invented a new type of a cryptocurrency. It's called some nonsense or whatever. It has absolutely no value because nobody's using it, right? So how do you make it more valuable? Well, what the game was, you offer to pay anybody who's willing to trade this useless new cryptocurrency for other cryptocurrencies that are actually worth something at that moment. If you paid them real US dollars, depending on how much they put in, what would happen is I would run on my free software that runs on a server that costs $3 a month. I would put in $200 US dollars, and I will tell the algorithm, the code of the cybernetic machine, trade these $200 5,000 times a second, capturing any change in the price between the US dollar and this totally useless, or the representation of this US dollar in cryptocurrency, relative this totally useless new cryptocurrency. Every time that it moves infinitesimally small amounts, trade it. Just trade it back and forth. Buy it for dollars, exchange it for dollars, back and forth, multiple thousands of times a second, or as fast as your computer can do it. The more money you spend, you can do it 1,000,000 times a second. The less money you spend, you can do it 5 times a second. And if 150,000 people did this at one time during the experiment that I did it over a 3-day period, so 150,000 servers, millions of times per second, and by the end of that week, that currency was worth $50 or $80 million, depending on the day. So if capital can do that in order to increase the initially invested value of dollars into 100 times that, or 35 times, or whatever times, in a total abstraction from the real economy or real human needs, the next logical question is, well, why do we need all that dead weight around for the proletariat? Can't they just die or something? Or can't we just get away from them in a way that we don't have to interact with them? We don't have to pay their health care. I mean, that is the emerging next political question. I'm sure in the calculus, what are we going to do with the generalized proletariat once the pool of the proletariat has expanded beyond blue collar, and now it includes increasingly white collar workers, and of course, even some of our old capitalist captains of industry who still think that is relevant for them to, make vacuum cleaners by using human and machine workers and then pay the 401k of their human workers. And then we're in the terrain of Klaus Schwab's Great Reset, which is genocidal politics. That's basically what these people have on the agenda. They may be polite about it. So, of course, what is the counter argument? Obviously, we're going to be using cybernetics insights in the counter-capitalist moment too. But maybe we don't have to start with the reduction of human beings into computing machines. Maybe if we don't do that, where does it take us, right? So these are, some initial, and the Great Reset, like Phil said.
I want to compliment Beth for the best email of the week when she sent the Starbucks joke. I don't know if everybody knows this, but this guy went to the Starbucks to get his coffee and he had to give his name. So he gave his name as Free Palestine while he's waiting for his coffee. So the Starbucks worker came out to call the name Free Palestine. So this is great, for a moment in which codes can be up, Free Palestine.
Ideally, you're not there. You have to call again and again. Free Palestine.
Free Palestine. Free Palestine. Yes, indeed. Yeah, so it was great. Beth passed that to us. Beth is the maven of finding these things on the internet, almost anything. So yeah. She knows the cybernetic revolution, at least in that respect, very well. She's probably off camera. You're right, but anyway, I want to thank her for that. Yeah. So So you want to close here? I mean, I know it's late for you, but we can stay on. But yeah, I mean, I thought this was very good because we at least starting the thing. Yeah. Damning with faint praise, she writes. Yeah, right. Anyway, but free
I
Palestine.
think there's something really, I don't know, that's my personal grudge. I think there's something very offensive to make statements that and act on those statements that reducing human beings to computing machinery.
Yeah,
I mean,
sure.
is that what you got from Descartes? I wish I could ask like these questions, like if I
No,
was alive in
it's
the
not
50s,
about that in
is
Descartes.
that your
First of all,
interpretation
he's
of
going to
Descartes?
push that limit further. He's going to push the limit all the way to extreme, doubt, to skepticism.
Or is that their,
Yes, he's not
is that
thinking about that. No.
is that Claude Shannon's interpretation
Yeah,
of
Claude
Galileo?
Shannon is
that
a
the
second-rate thinker compared to,
Well,
I mean,
what I'm saying is,
third-rate thinker.
should we follow the chief scientists of Google and Microsoft and the Ford Foundation into saying that Galilean science, which posits that anything that humans can have access to, right, can be mathematically modeled, right, and then proceed accordingly. It was that really this kind of oversimplification, Galileo's great insight, or is that really where we can stop? Of course not.
No, we need to read two dialogues concerning the world. We have to read that again.
Is
right?
the best way to avoid genocide in the future to chisel out through socialization those things which they, the irrational, the uncalculable urges, that in some kind of a weird chain link fashion led to genocide in World War II. Is that the best way to think the prevention of the next genocide? And of course, these are laughable. These are obviously, we know the answer to these questions, but unfortunately, if these kinds of people are sitting in places that are hegemonic in politics, are part of the common sense, at least thus far, that's really troubling. That's a real problem. To really treat people as simple computing machinery with input and output functions that can be manipulated by other people and thus, etc., improved or controlled or prevent. If that's really all they have, then capitalism really has run out of steam. Well, if that's their conceptual apparatus, then we really are in a field of systemic crisis. But then the problem is, what is the alternative?
Yes.
Right? What is the alternative that speaks and shows the poverty of ideas and vision that these people are offering us?
Well, 100
artificial
years ago,
intelligence.
Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world, right? And Yeats is slouching towards Bethlehem. Mere anarchy is the center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. I mean, Jean Genet put it very well. How can a system that's based on contempt of the human being survive, right? And I think you're raising the same question. I mean, he said it as a poet would say.
Or the contempt of some people.
Yes.
At the expense of other people, which is even worse.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. And it's a kind of an inversion of ressentiment towards any kind of progress and any kind of real development of the human subject that produces a kind of control of, a new slave morality. It's not a master morality as Nietzsche would speak about in terms of the noble class. There's no longer anything such as a noble class. There are no Peggy Guggenheims or Paninico in the jazz world anymore, right? They're not these kind of people that exist. This is a problem, going forward, right? We've lost that. So these people are really, in a sense, it's kind of a projection of the slave morality. When you really listen, what I've learned in a sense from watching Al Jazeera, I've watched it pretty religiously, just because of the dominant networks. It's got at least some stakes in the game, in the Middle East in a different way. And when I watch it, I begin to hear the people that are Palestinian or Al Jazeera reporters, how much more of a nobility and a mastery of the language and the efforts down there that they have than these people that represent the hegemon, right? In a sense, from everything from the IDF spokespeople to the Israeli spin doctors, etc. And it's kind of interesting to me. You have this inversion, right, in a sense of, now the rulers are really a class of ressentiment, in a way. I mean, I'm talking about values. And I think this is a point that we could really bring up and maybe make some kind of contribution in terms of a new kind of, a genealogy, right, of values and value systems that are being created. But you see it, as you say, you listen to these fools, right, and you're really hearing a slave morality at work here. It has nothing to do with becoming human, or even the process of becoming. It's, in a strange way. So I think this is something, we have to talk about too, vis-a-vis Weber, Marx, and others, Nietzsche, of course. Yeah, yeah. How has this new slave morality come to be, right? Yeah, especially when we go on to get to free to obey, right, in the modern management systems, right? Yeah.
In a way, and this
Yeah.
sounds crazy, but in a way, the management theory of the Nazis that became the bedrock, as we'll see, of modern business management in the European Union and elsewhere, in a way, that was the more dangerous part, it turns out, of the Nazi project, because resisting it is much more difficult, because it doesn't have that despicable physical manifestation of direct violence to it. Right. But it has this kind of slowly moving, oppressive force to it. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot of connections, but I think we should reconvene again and spend more time on the Wilden and some of the other sections.
Yes. Okay.
And go back and forth with some of the other fundamental ideas that went into cybernetics from some of its pioneers, yes, on language and the need to kind of control language in a way, or make it proper or usable, in ways that it's been not usable before. So we can do that next week, because it'll continue in this trajectory. Trying to see the genealogy of socialized cybernetics, basically, how it becomes a political.
Does Nicaragua have an ambassador in Israel? Phil, do you know? You don't know? Okay, because I know Bolivia, Chile, and Colombia have pulled representation, pulled out the ambassadors. Yeah. So anyway.
Yeah, they may have pulled it out before, but I don't know.
Yeah, you might be right. Maybe they were way ahead of the current game, in a way. Yeah. Wow. Okay. Well, good. So everybody, it's good. So Arto, you're going back on time. You'll be 7 hours next week, right? So fine, we can't change it to 5 o'clock because Beryl's up very early. But yeah,
it's fine. It's totally fine.
Good. For me. Okay. Yeah, because we'll give Beryl an extra half an hour in the morning to have a coffee, since she's in Australia. And then for Sebastian and Leslie, it would be 2. And Jeff, you're on the West Coast too, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that would be 2 for them. So yeah, why don't we do it next week? Is that okay? 5 for you? Yeah.
Well, the regular time, right?
Yeah.
The regular time.
Well, no, it'd be 5 o'clock our time, and it would be midnight for you, instead of 11:30. It would be a half an hour pushed up in terms of the beginning. Would that be okay with you? Or because you look alert at this time, I'm just projecting now.
Yeah, sure.
Now that we've stayed till for you it's 1 in the morning.
Yeah, sure.
So I'm testing. I'm good at this stuff.
Yeah. Let's try it.
Right. Okay. Great.
It'll be good.
All right, good. Okay, well, thank you, everybody. And so I'll read the Wilden again, the Wilden analog and digital communication. And just to get the structure of the book, the introduction's worth reading too. And I'll put that for Matt to send out as an email. The scientific discourse as propaganda. I think it gives you a sense of where he's really trying to go with this project, and how politicized it really is, the epistemological questions, and in my opinion, the ethical questions that he's raising here. And then, of course, we'll go back to more of the cybernetic pioneers and the revolution there, and what's going on. And I think Arto's right. There is this kind of underlying contempt, for quote unquote, people, right? In a sense, by these people. It's like watching Prince Charles with a group of Kenyan people. I don't know
exactly.
that Fred
Exactly.
photograph. But that kind of exemplifies, in an image, what's really
Yeah.
going on. Holding hand, did you see that stupid?
Yeah.
I mean, why he would even pose for something like that, knowing that there are people in the world, and they're not giving back any land, then a completely articulate Kenyan person who you can see would master King Charles in anything, Prince Charles in anything, and tell, is saying, we want our land back. we don't want this bullshit that he's coming in to say, I'm sorry. Give us land and capital without the labor that we gave you. So anyway, it's unbelievable. Yeah. But and I mean, they put this out as if people believe this. It's so nice. Look at this nobility, this fucking monarchy, excuse me, that's playing out with, a bunch of Kenyan children, right? Sitting there. I mean,
the monarchy has truly lost its spirit.
Mr. Kurtz, he dead, man. He dead. Right. Anyway. All right. So good. Okay. All right. So nice to see everybody. Yeah. So we'll see you next week. And hopefully, I think we're starting to get started now. It takes about 3 weeks to really get in the mix. Now we have some real good themes. Okay. Okay, good. Okay. Right. Thank you, Arto.
Thank you.
Cloud. You've got the control.
Thank you
on this.
Oh,
Thank you,
do?
Beryl. Nice to see you getting up so early, and we're going to give you that half an hour extra with the Java in the morning. Yeah.